The axe sliced through the air with deadly precision, striking Ulfric's chest. Blood surged as Torsten watched his enemy fall to his knees, the eyes of the man who had shattered his life years ago finally recognizing his executioner. "Remember the boy who watched silently as you dragged his mother away?" Torsten whispered, the scar on his face throbbing with the memory of that day. The silence is over. Thank you for being here and watching. This channel is just beginning, and every subscription means the world. It helps keep this project alive as we strive toward our first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy stories like this, please consider subscribing and sharing your city in the comments. It's always powerful to know where our listeners come from. Your support truly fuels the journey ahead. The morning light crept slowly over the jagged peaks that framed the narrow fjord, casting a pale, cold glow on the wooden roofs of the village nestled on the rocky coast. The wind whispered through the pine trees that clung stubbornly to the cliffs, carrying the salty tang of the sea and the faint, smoky aroma of wood fires burning in hearths. It was a biting dawn, the kind that hinted at the harsh winter to come, yet life stirred quietly within the village despite the chill. In the small cabin closest to the water's edge, the faintest flicker of warmth glowed through the gaps in the wooden walls. Inside, a young boy, barely 7 winters old, stirred beneath a rough linen blanket. His auburn hair spilled unevenly over the pillow, tangled and damp from sleep, framing a face still unmarked by the years of hardship that awaited him. Green-gray eyes blinked open, meeting the dim light filtering in through a shuttered window. Torsten Gunnarsson lay still for a moment, the distant call of gulls and the soft crashes of waves against jagged rocks weaving through the silence. The smell of pine smoke mixed with something sweeter, the unmistakable scent of porridge cooking over the fire. That familiar, comforting smell was a fragile thread tying him to a world still untouched by the shadows gathering beyond the horizon. His mother's voice hummed gently, blending with the crackle of flames. Sigrid Freyjasdottir moved gracefully across the floor, her golden hair pulled back in a loose braid dusted with strands of silver, catching the firelight in soft glimmers. She carried a wooden bowl in one hand and stirred thick porridge with the other, her face serene but lined with the quiet weariness of years spent enduring more than most could bear. "Torsten, wake now," she called softly, kneeling beside the bed. Her blue eyes shone with a warmth that belied the cold outside. "The sun rises, and your father will soon return from the hunt." The boy blinked again, his lips parting slightly as if to answer, but no words came. The silence that had settled over him in recent months was not from shyness or stubbornness. It was the heavy cloak of grief that wrapped tightly around his young heart. The world had grown smaller and darker since the last winter, when the Bloodaxe clan had descended like a storm, forever altering the course of his life. Sigrid's fingers brushed his tangled hair with a tenderness that seemed almost desperate, as if willing to shield him from the pain she could not erase. "Eat quickly now," she urged. "The day will be long, and you must be strong." Outside, the village slowly came to life. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint murmur of voices drifted on the wind. Fishermen prepared nets by the shore, their rough hands steady despite the cold. Children, bundled in worn furs, chased through narrow dirt paths while their mothers called after them, their voices cracked but steadfast. Torsten slipped from the warmth of his bed and shuffled toward the hearth, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Sigrid handed him the bowl of porridge, the steam rising like a whispered promise of comfort. The oats were thick, mixed with wild honey gathered from the forest, a rare sweetness in these hard times. As he ate, his eyes wandered to the small wooden carvings lining the shelf above the fire, tokens of his father's skill and stories etched into wood. Among them was a tiny raven, wings outstretched, the symbol of their clan. It was the emblem of the Raven Shield, a mark of pride and protection. Gunnar Håkansson, his father, was a man revered among their people, known for his courage and unwavering loyalty. At 7 years old, Torsten was already learning what it meant to be a son of the Raven Shield. His days were filled with lessons in survival: how to fish from the cold fjord, how to track the elusive reindeer in the dense forests, and how to hold a wooden sword with both strength and respect. Yet beneath his quiet exterior lay a restless spirit, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. The village itself was small, a cluster of sturdy wooden homes huddled close against the unforgiving elements. Moss and lichens clung to the weathered shingles, while the rocky soil bore the scars of countless seasons. Between the houses, narrow pathways twisted like veins, leading to the communal hall where the village gathered for feasts and council. Torsten's routine was simple but demanding. Mornings began with the rising sun, the cold air biting at exposed skin. After breakfast, he would accompany his father to the edge of the forest, watching in awe as Gunnar read the land like an open scroll. The elder's hands were rough from years of wielding bow and spear, his voice deep and steady as he taught his son the ways of the wild. "Look here," Gunnar would say, pointing to broken twigs and disturbed earth. "The stag passed this way last night. Quiet now, but soon he will return to drink from the stream." Torsten's heart beat faster at these lessons, a mixture of fear and excitement. To follow in his father's footsteps was both a calling and a burden. The clan depended on men like Gunnar to protect them, to hunt and fight when danger came. Yet beneath the surface, there was an unease that none dared speak aloud. The Blood Axe clan, fierce and relentless, had long been a shadow over their lands. Skirmishes and raids were whispered warnings, threats that loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. That morning, as Torsten prepared to leave for the shoreline with his father, the air was heavy with a sense of foreboding. The sea was a steel-gray mirror, the waves restless and choppy beneath a sky streaked with cold light. The wind moaned softly through the rigging of fishing boats tied to the docks. Gunnar's face was set, his jaw clenched against the cold. He exchanged grim nods with fellow hunters as they readied their spears and nets. The men were seasoned by years of struggle, their eyes sharp and wary. "Stay close, Torsten," Gunnar said, lifting the boy onto his strong shoulder for the short walk to the boats. "The sea is no friend to the careless." The boy's small hands gripped his father's fur cloak tightly, the scent of pine and salt mingling in his lungs. For a brief moment, the weight of the day felt lighter, as if nothing could touch them here. But fate, cruel and swift, had other plans. From the ridge above the village, faint silhouettes flickered into view. 6 longships cutting through the mist like dark beasts. Their sails were blood-red, emblazoned with the jagged axe of the rival clan, a symbol that stoked fear and hatred in the hearts of those who knew it. Torsten's breath caught as he pointed toward the approaching vessels, the color draining from his face. His mother's voice rose in alarm behind him, sharp and urgent. "Torsten, run," she commanded, her blue eyes wide with terror. In the chaos of the moment, she pushed him toward the back of their home, toward the barrel she had hidden beneath a pile of skins. The boy obeyed, heart pounding like a drum, as the first war cries shattered the morning. The village erupted into chaos, shouts, clashing metal, the roar of flames consuming wood and hope. Torsten pressed himself into the darkness, the scent of smoke stinging his nostrils. Through the narrow slats of the barrel, he saw the violence unfold, the clash of warriors, the desperate struggle of his father as he fought to defend their home. Each arrow that found its mark struck not just flesh, but the fragile thread of his childhood unraveling. His mother's screams pierced the din, a sound both fierce and broken. And then, the figure emerged, the tall man with the cruel scar, Ulfric Bloodaxe, towering above the fallen. He seized Sigrid, pulling her away from the ruin of their lives without a word. Torsten's world constricted to that single moment. The warmth of his mother's hand slipped. As seasons passed, Torsten's body hardened like the stones beneath the waves. His eyes, once full of childlike wonder, now held a storm of determination. The villagers came to know him as Torsten the Silent, a figure both respected and feared. But beneath the stoic exterior, the fire of a lost boy still burned, a fire destined to break free, no matter the cost. The nights at Ravenholm were colder than the sharpest blade, and the shadows clung like silent wraiths to every crevice of the fortress. Torsten moved through the dark corridors with the quiet certainty of a hunter stalking prey, every breath measured, every footfall hushed against the cold stone. His heart beat a relentless rhythm beneath his worn tunic, steady, though laced with the tension of 1,000 unspoken fears. The looming walls around him spoke of imprisonment and cruelty, but the faint glimmer of hope that flickered within his chest refused to be extinguished. He had left behind the safety of the forest, the comfort of the sea's steady pulse, and the warmth of Halvor's cabin. Each step toward the heart of Ulfric's stronghold was a step deeper into the unknown, a gamble with death itself. Yet, in the silence that wrapped him like a second skin, there was a steady refrain. His mother was alive, somewhere within these walls, and she needed him. As he rounded a corner, the scent of damp earth and smoke twisted with an undercurrent of fear. A soft sound reached his ears, a quiet sobbing, barely audible but unmistakably human. Torsten froze, every muscle coiled tight. The noise was faint, as if someone dared not breathe too deeply, lest the walls themselves betray their presence. He followed the sound cautiously, his gaze sweeping over the shadows for movement. The corridor opened into a small courtyard, a bleak patch of stone and frost under the cold night sky. There, huddled near a broken fountain, was a young woman. Her tangled hair caught in the moonlight revealed streaks of red and brown, and her thin frame shivered beneath a threadbare cloak. Her eyes, wide and wary, flicked toward him, startled, yet not entirely fearful. Kara. Her name had come to him in whispers, carried by other slaves' murmurs and furtive glances. A servant forced into chains by conquest, trapped beneath the weight of a cruel master's rule. She was a stranger among enemies, a flicker of defiance hidden beneath the surface of submission. And now, here she was, vulnerable, yet unbroken, a fragile thread tying Torsten closer to the truth he sought. For a long moment, neither spoke. Torsten's grip tightened instinctively around the hilt of his father's sword, the rough wood worn smooth by years of silent practice. His throat ached with the urge to break the silence, to call out, but the pact he'd made with himself held firm. No words, only action. Kara's voice came softly, a whisper carried by the cold air. "You're not meant to be here." Her gaze searched his face, reading the lines carved by years of hardship, the scars etched not just on skin but on spirit. "I've seen you before," she said, the edge of recognition flickering in her eyes. Among the trees, watching, silent as the grave. Torsten's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. In her presence, the years of isolation felt less suffocating, not spoken aloud, but felt in the steady beat of two hearts bound by unseen chains. She shifted closer, wary, but something in his stance spoke of purpose, of a will beyond mere survival. "There's danger here," she murmured. "Ulfric's men are restless tonight. They suspect something." Torsten nodded, his gaze drifting toward the fortress walls where torches burned low, casting flickering shadows like restless spirits. Every second counted. Kara's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her worn cloak, producing a small, polished stone, smooth from riverbeds, worn by time, a token of hope amid despair. "You'll need this," she said, pressing it into his palm. The weight of the stone was a stark contrast to the cold steel in his other hand. It was a simple thing, yet in that moment, it was a lifeline. Torsten's mind raced. torn between the instinct to flee and the weight of responsibility settling like lead in his chest. He could leave now, escape into the night, vanish like a shadow before the coming storm. But the thought of abandoning another soul, another captive tethered to this place, churned his stomach with bitter regret. He thought of his mother, silenced by years of servitude, broken but alive. And now Kara, a young woman trapped in this prison of stone and fear. The lines between their fates blurred. To save one would mean risking all. In the silence that stretched between them, Torsten made a choice. It was not one spoken or shouted, but carved into the very fiber of his being. He would not turn away. He would not be the shadow that watches and leaves the light to be extinguished. Kara's eyes softened, a flicker of hope breaking through the weariness. If you're truly here to fight, not just survive, then I'll help you. A fragile alliance, forged in the cold night, sealed not with words, but with shared resolve. Together, they moved from the courtyard, slipping through the labyrinth of stone like ghosts beneath the watchful eyes of guards. Kara led him to narrow passages known only to servants and slaves, hidden routes that skirted the fortress's heart. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and the faintest trace of despair. Torsten's fingers brushed the amulet beneath his tunic, a small wooden raven carved by his own hands, a symbol of his clan and his purpose. It was a silent prayer and a promise that no matter the cost, he would reclaim the light stolen from him so long ago. As they approached the inner quarters, the sounds of captivity grew louder, muffled cries, whispered prayers, the clinking of chains. Kara's steps faltered for a moment. This way, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. There are more than just slaves here. Some are broken beyond repair. The weight of her words settled heavy on Torsten's chest. He had known suffering, loss, and silence. But this was another kind of darkness, one that gnawed at the soul. His resolve hardened. The ghosts of his past, the stolen years, and the memory of his father's death fueled a fury as cold and sharp as the steel he carried. Yet beneath that fire was something more fragile, the hope that those shackled by cruelty might find freedom, if only for a moment, if only through his actions. The corridor opened into a small chamber dimly lit by a single candle. There, amidst the straw-strewn floor, sat a girl no older than 7, her hair a wild tangle of dark curls and dirt-smudged cheeks. Her wide eyes flickered with fear as Torsten stepped forward, but there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a distant kinship. Torsten knelt slowly, careful not to startle her. His eyes softened, though his voice remained locked in silence. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled a small carved wooden horse, a token he had kept since childhood, a symbol of innocence lost. The child reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the rough wood. A faint smile ghosted across her lips, fragile but real. For a moment, the weight of the fortress walls lifted, replaced by a fragile spark of warmth. Kara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay. They'll find us soon." Torsten's gaze lingered on the child, the stark contrast between innocence and the cruel world they inhabited cutting deeper than any blade. He knew that to save his mother, he had to risk more than his own life. He had to protect those caught in the crossfire, the forgotten, the broken. The decision settled like frost on his heart. He would not move forward alone. This fight was bigger than revenge. It was about reclaiming lost hope. Kara nodded, understanding the unspoken pledge. Together, they slipped from the chamber, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, a reminder of the peril that shadowed every step. As they vanished into the dark corridors once more, Torsten felt the weight of his silence begin to shift. In this moment, surrounded by fragile lives hanging by threads, the battle for his voice, for his spirit, was only just beginning. The moon hung low and heavy, casting a silver veil over the rugged landscape as Torsten made his way through the forest with Kara at his side. Each step was deliberate, measured against the chorus of as the first rays of dawn bled faintly across the horizon. The cabin came into view, its worn wooden walls glowing softly in the pale light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the scent of burning pine and fish mingling in the crisp morning air. Torsten's fingers instinctively brushed the small raven amulet hanging beneath his tunic, a silent talisman of his clan, a reminder of the past and a promise to the future. Kara hesitated at the threshold, her eyes wide and uncertain. The cracked wooden door creaked open, revealing the dim interior lit by a hearth's dying embers. Halvar sat hunched over a wooden table, his silver hair tangled and wild. A fishing net sprawled across his knees. When he looked up, his piercing blue eyes softened at the sight of Torsten, but flickered with suspicion at the stranger beside him. "Torsten," he rasped, voice thick with age yet steady as ever. "You've returned. And who is this?" Without a word, Torsten stepped forward, guiding Kara gently inside. The old man's gaze lingered on her slender frame, the faded marks of hardship visible beneath her ragged clothes. Halvar's mouth tightened briefly before he nodded, a silent acceptance passing between the three. The cabin was sparse but sturdy, rough wooden beams overhead, a small table cluttered with fishing tools, and a corner where thick animal pelts were piled to ward off the cold. A battered kettle hung over the hearth, the faint hiss of boiling water promising warmth and comfort. Torsten moved to the hearth, where the last embers flickered low, and quietly stoked the fire with a handful of dry twigs. The glow grew, casting dancing shadows across the worn floorboards. Kara sank onto a rough bench, her hands clutching her knees as if trying to hold herself together. Halvar shuffled to a small cupboard and produced a chipped bowl filled with coarse bread and dried salted fish. He placed it gently in front of her, nodding toward the food. "Eat, girl. You'll need your strength." Kara's fingers trembled as she reached out, breaking the bread into small pieces. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a faint nod of gratitude. The quiet between them was heavy, filled with unspoken histories and cautious trust. Torsten remained standing, his gaze drifting to the window where the fjord stretched wide and cold, its waters churning softly beneath the awakening sky. Memories stirred, his mother's laughter, the sharp scent of pine, the battles long past. Yet here, in this modest cabin, amidst the gentle crackle of fire and the steady presence of Halvar, the weight of those memories felt less crushing. Slowly, Torsten approached Kara, kneeling beside her on the bench. His hands reached out, gentle and deliberate, tracing the faint scars that marred her arms, silent testaments to the change she bore. She flinched but did not pull away, her deep amber eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. He produced a small cloth from his pack, soaked in warm water and scented faintly with herbs. Carefully, he dabbed at the worst of her wounds, the touch light yet reassuring. Kara's breath hitched, a sound half formed, as if a word hovered on the edge of her lips but remained locked behind fear. Halvar watched quietly from his chair, the firelight reflecting in the lines that mapped years of hardship on his face. "She's seen much pain," he murmured, voice low but steady. "But there's strength in her, the kind that doesn't break." Kara's gaze flicked between the two men, a flicker of something unspoken passing like a shadow across her features. Slowly, she pulled from beneath her dress a small, polished stone, the same river-worn token she had given Torsten earlier. She pressed it into his palm, the weight cool and real. Torsten's fingers closed around it, the rough surface grounding him in this fragile moment. The stone was simple, yet heavy with meaning, hope carved from brokenness. Time passed in quiet companionship. The fire crackled, the wind whispered outside, and within the walls of the cabin, the fragile threads of trust began to weave together. Torsten sat beside Kara, who had curled into a small ball, seeking warmth. Without words, he draped a worn wolf's pelt over her shoulders, the course for a shield against the lingering cold. In the depth of that silence, a connection blossomed, not forged by spoken promises, but by shared history and the unyielding will to survive. Torsten saw in Kara's eyes the same determination that burned within himself, the desire to reclaim something lost, to defy the shadows that sought to consume them. As the sun rose higher, warming the room with its pale light, Halvar stirred, rising with the creak of old bones. He moved with deliberate care, producing a bowl of steaming broth and passing it to Kara. She accepted it without hesitation, the warmth soothing her like a balm. Torsten watched her, the lines of fatigue softened by the gentle heat and the safety of the cabin. For the first time since leaving Ravnholm, the tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. The journey ahead was still uncertain, fraught with danger and darkness. But here, within these humble walls, there was a glimmer of something precious, the promise of healing. Kara's fingers curled tightly around the bowl, a small, fragile smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was a smile not born of joy, but of relief, a quiet defiance against the cruelty that had shaped her world. Torsten's green-gray eyes met hers once more, and in that gaze lay an unspoken vow. They were no longer alone. Together, they would face the long winter yet to come. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of pine and sea, whispering ancient songs of resilience and renewal. Inside, the fire burned steady, a beacon against the encroaching cold. And in the midst of it all, a silent pact was forged between a mute warrior, a broken slave, and an old fisherman who believed in the strength of forgotten souls. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the fragile, fierce hope of those who refused to be broken. The fragile calm that had settled over the small cabin by the fjord was destined to shatter. News, like wildfire in the dry brush of winter's edge, began to stir beyond the dense forests and rugged cliffs that sheltered Torsten and his companions. The whispers of a broken fortress, a daring rescue, and the disappearance of Ulfric Bloodaxe prized captive rippled through villages and camps, reaching ears both curious and hostile. For days after their escape from Ravnholm, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the wounded. Yet even within these walls, tension coiled beneath the surface like a serpent ready to strike. The outside world was changing, and with it came the relentless pressure of forces beyond Torsten's control. Halvar paced the wooden floorboards with the weariness of a man who had seen too many storms, his eyes clouded with concern. "You cannot hide here forever," he said in his gravelly voice, the lines on his face deepening with each word. "Word travels fast. The blood axe will not forget what you have done." Torsten sat near the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. The silence that had been his shield now felt like a cage tightening around his chest. He traced the outline of the wooden raven nestled beneath his tunic, the symbol of his clan and the promise he carried. Beside him, Kara stirred quietly, still pale but regaining some strength. Her amber eyes met his briefly, a silent question hanging in the cold air. Beyond the cabin's fragile walls, the world was shifting. Traders returning from distant markets carried rumors of a man with fiery hair and a silent fury who had dared to challenge the blood axe. The tale spread across the fjords and valleys like a ghostly wind, unsettling both friends and foes. One morning, as the pale sun struggled to pierce the thick mist, a group of hunters arrived at the village edge. Their faces were stern, marked by the harshness of the wild lands they traversed. Among them was Bjorn, a scout from a neighboring clan known for his sharp eyes and sharper tongue. He had heard the rumors and come with a warning. Halvar met them at the entrance to the village, his gait slow but unyielding. "Bjorn," he greeted, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. What news do you bring? Bjorn's gaze swept over the few remaining villagers, lingering on Torsten's cabin before settling on the old fisherman. The blood axe are restless. One evening, as the cold wind howled through the trees, a delegation arrived at Halvor's cabin. They bore the emblem of the Raven Shield, a sign that the old clan was watching. Among them was Einar, a burly warrior with a face weathered by countless battles, his eyes sharp and wary. "We have heard the tales," Einar said bluntly, stepping inside the dimly lit room. "Torsten Gunnarsson has stirred the hornet's nest. The blood axe will not rest until they taste vengeance." Halvar nodded grimly. "Our boy carries the weight of many. But he is not alone." Einar's gaze flickered to Kara and then back to Torsten. "The clans will come. They will send spies, assassins, and worse. You must be ready to face not just the blood axe, but those who see this as an invitation to war." Torsten absorbed the warning in silence, the promise of conflict settling like frost beneath his skin. He knew the path ahead was fraught with peril, not only for himself, but for those he cared for. The world beyond the fjord was unforgiving, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Days later, as the village gathered around the central fire, a scout returned breathless and pale. "Tracks," he reported, voice trembling. "Enemies have been here. They searched for signs, asking questions. They know we harbor the lost." The realization sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and warriors exchanged grim looks. The boundaries between friend and foe blurred in the growing shadow of suspicion. Torsten watched from the edge of the gathering, his heart a tumult of conflicting emotions. He felt the pull of loyalty to his people and the fierce need to protect the fragile hope he carried. Yet, that hope was a flame flickering in the wind of mounting danger. Kara approached quietly, her voice a soft murmur. "They will come. Soon." He nodded, the heaviness in his chest grounding him. The time for hiding was over. The silent boy who had witnessed his world torn apart was no longer content to vanish in the shadows. That night, beneath a sky heavy with stars and silent omens, Torsten stood alone on the rocky shore. The cold wind bit at his skin, carrying the scent of salt and pine. His fingers traced the familiar shape of the wooden raven, the talisman carved in youthful hope and hardened by years of silence. His mind drifted back to the day when all had changed, the brutal attack, the loss, the vow that had shaped his every breath since. The faces of his father, his mother, and the friends he had lost swirled through his thoughts like ghosts whispering from the past. He clenched his fists, feeling the rough leather of his gloves and the cold steel of his sword resting against his side. The silence within him was fracturing, replaced by a fierce resolve that no enemy could silence. The dawn would bring the reckoning. The clans would gather, the old wounds reopened by the flames of vengeance and justice. Torsten understood the cruel irony. His quest for peace was bound to unleash more pain. Yet in the depths of his soul, beneath the scars and the silence, a fragile truth blossomed. He would fight not just for revenge, but to protect the broken and the lost, to give voice to the voiceless, to light a path through the darkness that had long consumed his world. As the first light touched the horizon, casting long shadows over the fjord, Torsten turned from the sea. The coming storm was inevitable, but so was his defiance. The silence was over, and the fight had only just begun. The cold wind howled like a restless spirit through the skeletal branches of the pines, whipping the smoky tendrils of flame from the village's watchfires into the darkened sky. Around the flickering embers gathered the villagers, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and a simmering determination. The fragile peace that had guarded them since Torsten's return had shattered into shards beneath the weight of rumors and threats. Now, the Blood Axe clan's wrath loomed closer than ever, a storm ready to drown their world in fire and blood. Torsten stood apart, near the edge of the gathering, his gaze fixed on the gathering shadows beyond the fjord. His fingers unconsciously traced the rough wood of the raven amulet beneath his cloak. It was a symbol of home, of loss, and of the silent promise he had carried since childhood. Though his lips remained sealed, the fire in his eyes burned fiercely, reflecting the turmoil twisting in his chest. Halvar approached slowly, his aged footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The old fisherman's weathered face carried the weight of many winters, and now it was shadowed with concern deeper than the cold air pressing upon them. "They will come before the moon rises," Halvar murmured, voice low but steady. "Ulfric's fury is no idle threat. The blood axe will bleed this land dry if they must." Torsten's gaze sharpened. He thought of his mother, thin and broken but alive, held captive in the fortress that had become a tomb. The thought of losing her again twisted his gut like a knife. Yet surrender was not an option. Not now. From the darkness across the water, torches flickered one by one, the approaching warships of the Blood Axe. Their ominous red banners snapped cruelly in the wind, the jagged axe symbol a grim reminder of the enemy's relentless hunger. The village elders gathered near the fire, voices low and tense as they debated their scant options. Some urged flight, to scatter like shadows into the wilderness. Others called for a desperate stand, steel in hand, to defend their ruined homes and fragile lives. Torsten's sharp green-gray eyes scanned the faces around him, the weary mothers clutching their children, the men who had once been hunters and fishermen now forced to wield axes and bows against a tide of vengeance. Their fear was palpable, but so was their resolve. Kara stood silently near Torsten, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight and the same fierce determination that burned within him. Though young and broken by chains, she had become a steadfast ally, a quiet beacon in the encroaching darkness. As the torches multiplied across the fjord's edge, the first war cries shattered the stillness, a chilling chorus that rolled over the water like thunder. The Blood Axe clan had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs, and to punish the village for its defiance. Torsten moved through the crowd, his steps measured yet purposeful. He stopped before the gathered fighters, silent but commanding. Though his voice had been stolen years ago by grief, the strength of his presence spoke volumes, a living testament to the pain and the power of those who refused to yield. Halvar's voice broke through the noise, rough and resolute. "Tonight, we stand not just for our lives, but for the memory of those stolen from us, for the silence broken, for the fallen." The villagers responded with low, steady murmurs, a chorus of defiance rising in the cold night. Torsten's eyes met those of each man and woman, silently promising that he would fight with all that remained within him. The first clash came swift and brutal. Shadows spilled across the rocky shore as the Blood Axe warriors stormed the village, axes swinging and shields clashing. The air filled with the sounds of battle, the ring of steel, the thud of bodies striking earth, the strained cries of pain and fury. Torsten was a tempest in the midst of chaos, moving with the lethal grace of a born fighter. Every strike was precise, every block deliberate. His wooden raven amulet shifted against his chest as his heart hammered, the silent oath echoing with every blow. Ulfric Bloodaxe was there, towering above others like a living mountain of wrath. His scarred face twisted in a cruel sneer as he swung his massive war axe, each strike promising death. The sound of his voice was like grinding stone, bellowing orders and curses that tore through the night. Torsten met his gaze across the battlefield, the years of silence between them heavy and electric. The man who had stolen his mother and shattered his childhood was now the adversary who would face the full weight of his long-held fury. The clash was inevitable. Steel rang against steel as Torsten and Ulfric locked blades. The older man's strength was immense, but Torsten fought with the speed and precision born of years of silent training and unyielding purpose. Each movement was a conversation without words, a dance of life and death that told the story of wounds unseen but deeply felt. Ulfric's voice cut through the roar of battle, cruel and contemptuous. You think your silence hides you? You are nothing. Despite Ulfric's sheer strength and experience, Torsten's fury was a force no blade could fully contain. A sudden opening appeared, a flash of weakness in the older man's guard. Seizing the moment, Torsten struck, a precise blow that sent Ulfric stumbling back, the heavy axe slipping from his grasp. Breathing hard, Ulfric fell to one knee, his scarred face twisting with disbelief. Torsten stepped forward, sword poised, the weight of years pressing down with the sharpness of steel. But he did not strike to kill. Instead, Torsten dragged his blade across Ulfric's cheek, carving a thin, cruel scar that mirrored the mark emblazoned on his own face. The blood that welled was not just a wound, it was a message. Live with the mark of your dishonor, Torsten said, voice steady and fierce. As I have lived with the ghosts of my past. The battlefield stilled for a heartbeat, the clash of war giving way to a silence heavy with meaning. Ulfric stared at the narrow line reddening his skin, his eyes burning with a mixture of humiliation and rage. Slowly, he rose, the weight of defeat settling like a stone in his chest. Torsten turned, his gaze searching the night for his mother. There, among the wounded and the weary, stood Sigrid, older, worn by years of servitude and sorrow, but alive. Her blue eyes met his, tears glistening, and for the first time in 15 years, words passed between them. Torsten, she whispered, voice trembling but clear. His lips parted, and the silence shattered as he spoke again, this time not in whispers, but in the strength of a voice reclaimed. Mother, we go home. Together with Kara, they moved through the aftermath, the broken bodies, the smoldering remains, and the rising dawn. The villagers rallied, their spirits rekindled by the victory and the promise of rebuilding. Halvar stood nearby, watching the reunion with a quiet pride. Though his hands trembled with age, his eyes were steady, reflecting the dawn's light and the resilience of those who had endured. Torsten's steps were heavier now, but lighter too, burdened by the scars of memory, but buoyed by the strength of his voice and the bonds forged in fire. Above, the sky blushed with the soft hues of morning, the fierce cold softened by the promise of a new beginning. The fjord stretched wide and endless, a mirror to the possibilities that awaited beyond the shadows of the past. The silence was no longer a shackle. It was a song of survival, broken but unbroken. And as Torsten looked to the horizon, the weight of years lifted, replaced by the fierce hope of a son who had found his voice, his family, and his home once more. The dawn stretched slowly across the fjord, pale and hesitant, as if uncertain whether the light could hold back the lingering shadows. The village lay battered but breathing, alive with the quiet murmurs of those who had witnessed the storm and survived. Among the scattered remnants of broken shields and shattered wood, a fragile calm settled, a breath held between chaos and hope. Torsten stood near the edge of the shore, the weight of the night's violence still pressing deep into his bones. His sword hung loosely at his side, the blade catching the faint morning light like a silent witness to the battles fought, not just on the field, but within himself. His green-gray eyes scanned the horizon, seeking something beyond the distant line where sea met sky. It was not the land he sought now, but a place where silence could finally give way to healing. Behind him, the village stirred with cautious life. Women tended to wounds and soot-stained children, their hands trembling but steady as they worked. The men who had borne arms gathered in small circles, voices low but resolute, sharing stories of loss and survival. The fire that once threatened to consume their homes now burned in hearths, a fragile symbol that even amid ruin, warmth could be found. Kara moved quietly through the growing light, her steps light but sure despite the weariness etched into her young face. She paused near the center of the village, where an old woman sat on a rough bench, her fingers knitting threadbare cloth while her eyes reflected the long nights of fear and sorrow. For a moment, Kara's gaze softened, the harsh lines of captivity melting into something almost like tenderness. Among the broken souls, small acts of care became acts of defiance, silent rebellions against the darkness. Halvar's voice broke the gentle rhythm of the morning as he called out from the edge of the gathering. Come, all who have stood and survived. It is time to honor what remains. Slowly, the villagers gathered near the great stone where once the clan had held council before the blood axe's shadow fell. Torsten, standing tall despite the rawness of his wounds and the fatigue dragging at his limbs, stepped forward. Though his lips had been sealed for so many years, the fire in his eyes spoke louder than any word could. The old fisherman approached beside him, leaning on his worn staff. This day, Halvar began, his voice steady and clear despite the tremors of age. We remember not only those taken by death or chains, but those who remain, those who fight with heart and spirit. We are broken, yes, but broken is not defeated. Murmurs of agreement spread like a ripple through the crowd. Faces once etched with despair now bore traces of something else, a tentative, flickering strength. Mothers looked to their children with renewed hope. Warriors nodded in silent promise. Halvar's gaze settled on Torsten, a knowing warmth beneath the concern. This boy, silent for so long, has spoken with the blade of justice and the courage of 1,000 battles. His fight is ours now. Torsten's eyes flickered toward the small wooden raven hanging at his chest, the worn talisman carved by his own hands in years long past. It was a symbol not just of clan, but of the promise he had carried through every shadowed step. The promise that neither blood nor silence would define him forever. Kara stepped forward beside him, her amber eyes meeting his with unspoken understanding. Though her voice was still fragile, her presence spoke volumes. Together, they formed a fragile bond, two souls born from suffering, now standing as pillars of hope. The villagers began to share their stories, each voice a thread weaving a tapestry of resilience. An elder spoke of the long winters when food was scarce, but spirits remained unbroken. A young father recounted the moments he shielded his family from flames and fury. Children, too young to understand fully, held hands in quiet solidarity, their innocence a promise of days yet to come. Amid the gathering, Torsten's mother, Sigrid, sat quietly on a carved wooden stool near the center. Her once golden hair had faded to a silvery sheen, her hands marked by years of servitude, but her eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held a spark that had only begun to rekindle. She watched her son with a mixture of awe and sorrow, the weight of lost years balanced by the relief of reunion. Torsten approached slowly, each step heavy but purposeful. When he reached her side, he knelt, the familiar ache of the earth beneath his knees grounding him. His fingers brushed the worn amulet that hung around her neck, the same runic charm he had carved for her so many years ago, now faded but still whole. Without words, he pressed his palm against hers, a touch that spoke of forgiveness and the unspoken bond between mother and son. Their eyes met, hers moist with unshed tears, his steady and unwavering. In that shared silence lay a profound redemption, the healing of wounds deeper than flesh. Sigrid's voice broke the stillness, fragile yet clear. You have come home. Torsten's gaze flickered toward the villagers, the faces of those who had held the line during the darkest hour. The weight of his silence lifted, replaced by a quiet strength forged in the fire of loss and the courage to begin anew. At that moment, a figure stepped forward from the crowd, a young boy no older than 7 winters, clutching a small wooden horse carved in crude hands. He looked up at Torsten with wide eyes filled with awe and hope. You are Torsten, the child whispered, voice trembling with wonder. Torsten knelt again, reaching out to touch the boy's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance and connection. The boy's small fingers brushed the scar along Torsten's brow, a mark that no longer symbolized pain, but survival. The sun hung low in the sky, its pale light stretching across the fjord like a soft promise after the long night's storm. The village, once a fragile cluster of homes marked by loss and shadow, now breathed with renewed strength. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, mingling with the crisp pine-scented air, carrying with it the scent of hearth fires and fresh bread. The wounds of battle had not yet fully healed, but the scars were no longer just reminders of pain. They had become symbols of endurance, of a shared struggle that bound the villagers closer than before. Torsten stood at the edge of the shore, his eyes tracing the horizon where the sea met the sky in a quiet embrace. His breath rose in steady clouds, mingling with the salt-laden wind that whispered of change. The wooden raven amulet rested heavy against his chest, its carved wings worn smooth by years of touch and silent vows. There was a calmness now, fragile yet undeniable, a stillness that followed the storm, a space where new roots could take hold. Behind him, the village pulsed with life. Children played cautiously among the stones, their laughter like tentative sparks of light. Women gathered near the communal fire, weaving fresh cloth and sharing stories that no longer trembled with fear. Men tended the fields and repaired broken fences, their hands steady with purpose rather than despair. The old hall, scarred by flames but standing proud, was once again the heart of their community, a place where voices rose in song and counsel, healing the fractures left by war. Sigrid moved among the people with a quiet dignity that had deepened over the years. Her hair, streaked now with silver, caught the weak sunlight as she bent over to help a young girl mend a torn cloak. Her blue eyes held traces of sorrow, yes, but also a fierce love that no captivity could extinguish. When her gaze met Torsten's across the gathering, a connection passed between them. The unspoken acknowledgement of battles fought in silence, and the fragile hope of days yet to come. Kara lingered near the hearth, her hands busy but her eyes scanning the crowd with cautious alertness. The chains of her past had been broken, but the weight of memory lingered like a shadow at the edges of her smile. Her presence was a quiet defiance, a living testament to the possibility of freedom born from pain. Over time, she had become not merely an ally but a thread woven into the fabric of the village's future. The villagers had embraced her, not as a stranger or a captive, but as kin. Children who once eyed her with suspicion now sought her out as a storyteller, their small faces lighting up at her tales of faraway lands and star-filled skies. The women shared the chores and the burdens, their hands working side by side, bridging divides forged in blood with acts of kindness and common purpose. Halvar sat near the fire, his weathered hands resting on his gnarled staff. The old fisherman's blue eyes, though dimmed by time, sparkled with quiet pride. He had watched the boy grow into a man, silent, fierce, unyielding, and witnessed the rebirth of a village that refused to be broken. Now, as the embers glowed low, he hummed a low tune, an ancient song that carried the weight of generations and the promise of healing. A soft breeze stirred the branches overhead, carrying the faint rustle of pine needles and the sweet scent of wildflowers pushing through the rocky earth. It was a sound of renewal, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, life found a way to persist. Near the center of the village, a small wooden altar had been erected, fashioned from driftwood and adorned with simple offerings, woven grasses, pieces of amber, and carved runes. It was a place of remembrance and reverence, where the living honored those lost and honored the cycles of death and rebirth so central to their way of life. Torsten approached the altar, his boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened earth. He knelt slowly, the weight of years pressing upon him. a burden carried not just in flesh but in memory. His fingers traced the rough carvings of the runes, symbols of protection and hope, etched with the hands of the village's craftsmen. The air was still, filled with the hum of 1,000 whispered prayers and the steady heartbeat of the earth beneath. He placed a small wooden raven on the altar, the same that had hung around his neck since childhood, now smooth and worn from countless touchings. It was a symbol of clan, of identity, and of the silent promise that had fueled his journey. Around it, he laid a simple braid of wildflowers, a gift from Kara, whose hands had plucked them from the nearby meadow at dawn. In that quiet moment, the past and future converged, the stolen years, the broken silences, and the fragile threads of new beginnings. Torsten's gaze lifted to the sky, where clouds drifted lazily, painting shapes that seemed to tell stories of gods and men alike. The wind whispered softly, carrying the echoes of ancient voices, Odin's wisdom, Freya's strength, Thor's thunder, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the gods watched and the earth endured. As he rose, Torsten felt a shift within himself. The silence that had long defined him was no longer a cage, but a space where hope could grow. Though his voice had once been stolen by grief, it now found strength in the quiet acts of forgiveness and renewal. He was no longer the boy who watched helplessly, but a man who chose to heal rather than destroy. The village gathered as the evening deepened, the sky turning a deep indigo speckled with stars. Around the fire, voices rose in song, low and steady, a melody older than memory, weaving together sorrow and joy, loss and hope. Kara's clear voice joined the chorus, weaving a thread of warmth through the cold night air. Torsten stood nearby, silent but present, his green-gray eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Children nestled against their mothers, their faces bright with wonder. The elders nodded in time with the song, their eyes misty with the remembrance of battles fought and loved ones lost. The firelight danced across weathered faces, illuminating the resilience etched deep within. From the shadows, a young boy approached Torsten, clutching a small wooden horse carved with clumsy hands. His wide eyes fixed on the scar that marked the older man's brow, a symbol once of pain, now of survival and strength. "You are Torsten," the child whispered, voice trembling but filled with awe. Torsten knelt, his hand reaching out to rest gently on the boy's shoulder. The touch was heavy with meaning, a silent passing of legacy, an unspoken invitation into a future still uncertain but bright. Around them, the village embraced the moment, the convergence of past and future, the unbroken chain of lives shaped by loss but bound by love. In the flickering firelight, shadows shifted and blended, forming shapes that seemed to dance with the ghosts of ancestors and the dreams of their descendants. Halvor's voice rose above the song, steady and proud. "We are the broken who live, the silent who speak through deeds, the lost who find their way home." As the night deepened, the villagers remained gathered, their voices weaving an anthem of endurance and hope. The scars of the past would not vanish, but they would no longer define. Instead, they would be honored as reminders of the cost of survival and the price of peace. Torsten's gaze drifted to the horizon once more, where the first hints of dawn began to stir behind the jagged peaks. The sea whispered promises of journeys yet to come, of lands to explore and homes to rebuild. The weight of silence had lifted, replaced by a voice reclaimed, a voice that would carry the stories of the fallen, the broken, and the brave into the long nights ahead. In the quiet, beneath the vast expanse of stars, Torsten allowed himself a breath he had long denied. The journey was far from over, but the first step had been taken. The past was honored, the present embraced, and the future held tight in the hands of those who dared to hope. The village, scarred but unbroken, stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Blood had been shed, voices silenced, and lives shattered, but from the ashes rose a new song. It was a song of survival, of beginnings born from endings, and the fierce, unyielding power of silent resolve. The silence was over. The voice was found, and around him, the village stirred with cautious life. Faces, weathered, worn, but unyielding, emerged from the shadows of a long night. Women gathered by the hearths, their hands steady despite the tremors of exhaustion. Children chased faint beams of sunlight, their laughter fragile but real, weaving threads of hope into the fabric of a community reborn. Men sharpened blades, not simply for battle, but to carve a future from the remnants of the past. Torsten's gaze lingered on the horizon where sky and sea met, a boundary both infinite and intimate. The same line where years ago his childhood had shattered beneath the blades of the blood axe. Yet now, standing at the edge of that same world, the line seemed less a divide and more a passage, a portal from silence to speech, from loss to renewal. His fingers brushed the wooden raven amulet hanging beneath his tunic, a talisman worn smooth by years of touch and silent promises. It was no longer just a symbol of clan or vengeance. It was a testament to endurance, to the fragile power of memory, and to the unspoken song of survival. Sigrid moved quietly beside him, her steps lighter now, as if the chains that once bound her spirit had loosened in the light of this new day. Her blue eyes met his with a mixture of sorrow and fierce pride, the kind that only a mother carries when she has seen her child suffer and return stronger. The years of servitude and silence could not erase the bond between them, nor the fierce love that had endured beyond chains and scars. Kara stood a short distance away, her amber eyes watching the village come alive with a cautious but growing strength. The chains of her past had been broken, but the shadows lingered in her gaze, reminders of pain that had not yet fully faded. Yet in that same gaze burned a determination born not of defeat, but of defiance. She was no longer just a captive. She was a part of something larger, a thread woven into the fragile tapestry of hope. Halvar, the old fisherman whose hands had steadied Torsten's youth and whose wisdom had guided many through dark days, sat near the fire's fading embers. His eyes, though dimmed by age, shone with quiet pride. He hummed an ancient tune, a melody older than memory, one that carried the weight of generations, of loss, resilience, and the enduring spirit of those who refused to be broken. Torsten's thoughts drifted back to the days when the village was nothing but ashes and silence, when the blood axe had come with fire and fury, tearing apart the fragile threads of their lives, when he had hidden beneath the barrel, trembling and voiceless, watching the world unravel in brutal waves. The scars on his face and soul whispered of those dark winters, of promises made in silence and vengeance forged in quiet resolve. But now, the silence was no longer a shackle. It was a song, fragile but unyielding, a melody composed in the spaces between words and wounds. It was the sound of a voice reclaimed, not through vengeance alone, but through the courage to begin again. The villagers gathered slowly in the open square, their faces turned toward the rising sun. They bore the marks of battle and loss, scars, bandages, worn furs, but also a newfound strength that came from surviving the storm and choosing to stand. Their eyes held a rare light, the fierce glow of those who have faced death and decided to live. Torsten stepped forward, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Though his lips had been sealed for so many years, his presence spoke with the clarity of 1,000 spoken words. The silence that had once protected him now gave way to a voice that carried the weight of history and the hope of tomorrow. He lifted his hand, fingers curling around the carved wooden raven, and held it before the village. The symbol was more than a clan emblem. It was a beacon cast into the long shadows, a reminder of home, honor, and the promises that bind them all. Halvar's voice broke the quiet, steady and strong despite the tremor of age. We are the broken who live, the silent who speak through deeds, the lost who find their way home. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a chorus of agreement that seemed to weave itself into the morning air. Mothers clutched children close, warriors adjusted their grips on worn weapons, and elders nodded with quiet pride. The wounds of the past were real and raw, but they no longer defined the future. Kara moved beside Torsten, stepping into the light with a strength that surprised even her. The girl who had once been a silent captive now stood as a symbol of resilience and quiet rebellion. Her fingers brushed the small stone she carried, a token of luck and hope, and she met Torsten's gaze with unspoken understanding. Together, they formed a fragile alliance not born of words, but of shared scars and unyielding will. They had fought through silence and captivity, loss and pain, and now stood as living proof that survival demands more than strength, it demands heart. Torsten's eyes scanned the crowd, resting briefly on the youngest among them, a boy no older than 7 winters, clutching a crudely carved wooden horse. The child's wide eyes held awe and hope, reflecting the legacy that had been passed down through blood and silence. The boy approached hesitantly, voice trembling but clear. "You are Torsten." Without a word, the man knelt, his hand reaching out to rest gently on the child's shoulder. The touch was heavy with meaning, a silent promise passed from one generation to the next. The scar along Torsten's brow, once a mark of pain, now told a story of endurance and survival. Halvar's voice rose above the murmurs, rich and unwavering. "This is the future we fight for, the children who will bear the scars of our battles, but also the legacy of our strength." The villagers slowly began to share their stories. Each voice, a thread in a tapestry woven from loss and hope. The old tales spoke of winters harsher than stones, of fires that devoured homes but not spirits, of love that survived chains and silence. Through trembling lips and steady hands, they spoke of rebirth from ruin, of the fierce will to endure. Torsten listened, absorbing the words like the steady pulse of the earth beneath his feet. The past was heavy, but it no longer crushed him. It had become the soil in which hope could take root. Sigrid's voice, though soft, carried weight as she spoke beside him. "You have come home." Her words echoed in the quiet space between them, a balm and a blessing. The years of captivity and sorrow had not broken the bond between mother and son. It had been tested, worn, but never severed. Torsten's lips parted, and the sound that emerged was no longer silence, but a voice reclaimed, a low, steady sound that carried the strength of every lost year. Home. The villagers gathered closer, their faces illuminated by the firelight and the first blush of dawn. The wounds of battle would heal slowly, but the spirit that had carried them through would endure. Torsten, Sigrid, Kara, and Halvar stood together, bound by shared pain and the fragile promise of a new beginning. As the sun rose higher, its light spilled over the fjord, softening the harsh edges of the rocky shore and bathing the village in a golden glow. The silence was over. The voice was found, and the journey home, both physical and spiritual, had truly begun. In that moment, Torsten understood something deeper than vengeance or justice. He saw that the scars they bore, visible and invisible, were not marks of defeat but of survival. That the strength to carry a broken past was the greatest power of all. As the villagers began to rebuild, brick by timber by hand, the echoes of their ancestors' songs filled the air. Odin's wisdom, Freya's courage, Thor's might, all woven into the fabric of their lives. The gods watched quietly as men and women forged new paths from the ashes of old wounds. Torsten's gaze drifted once more to the horizon, where the sea promised journeys yet to come. The weight of silence had finally lifted, replaced by a voice that carried the stories of the fallen, the broken, and the brave. A voice that would echo long after the fires faded. The winds whispered ancient truths through the pines, as endless and steady as the tide. Survival is not the absence of pain, but the courage to rise beyond it. The story of Torsten Gunnarsson, a child who had...
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.